I had to do a double take when I looked back at Ori and the Blind Forest's original release date, because it's felt like an eternity since that game came out. But shockingly, it's only been 5 years between Blind Forest and this month's Will of the Wisps. The gameplay landscape has changed a ton in that time, but what's best about the Ori series hasn't. I can only really say so much since I never played the original, but everything that everybody ever talked about, the awesome platforming, the bash ability's place in that core loop, and that jaw-dropping escape sequence, all find themselves right at home here, just as entertaining 5 years later. And they come with a slightly expanded cast, a new forest of friends and giant creatures to interact with, and a full-on combat system. That's a lot to cover, so let's get to it. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're saving another forest in Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Ori and the Will of the Wisps comes at you pretty fast. I swear, this game gives you new abilities like every 15 minutes. By the end of Hour 2, I had Ori's signature bash attack, a dash move, a bow to hit switches, a double jump, a regeneration ability, and a giant hammer. The pace at which players are expected to pick up new ideas might be a little daunting for anyone new to games in general, but for someone like me with enough experience to roll with it and no time to be strung along, this kind of design is a godsend. Doubly so because so many of these abilities feel absolutely integral to Ori's kit, and in that light, it makes sense that they try to get them in your hands as quickly as you can humanly process them. These abilities expand the possibility space so much that it felt like acquiring formerly missing limbs at times, and at no point was that more palpable than with the game's first few hours of combat. Combat in Ori takes a lot of getting used to, most notably because there's no real dodge roll or form of damage mitigation, especially early on. Your bash can kind of parry attacks, but the resulting knockback rarely puts you in a position where you can properly counterattack, and when it shares the same context button as a grapple hook, it's not the most reliable option. Combine this with certain enemies that literally just never stop trying to attack you, and combat can be frustrating to adjust to. But adjust I did. Especially once that kit starts getting more fleshed out with additional attacks, I started enjoying it a lot more. However, I can't help but wonder how much of my fun comes down entirely to dumb luck. Because there's a specific moment in this game where you come across a shopkeeper who's all like, and the ability I randomly picked, Smash, ended up being the best fun I've had with the combat so far. This massive hammer is hysterically strong, and just as likely as not to send your enemy flying into a pit of spikes. And after buying a few more of these abilities and being less impressed with them, I dread to imagine what my impression of combat might have been had I chosen poorly. Ultimately, I've come away from my 5 hours with Ori feeling like combat was serviceable. Bosses are actually pretty enjoyable once you get the dance down, and outside of harder optional challenges I flatly refuse to do, it doesn't get in the way of enjoying the rest of the game, which, I might say, is pretty damn excellent. Everything the original was known for comes back with a vengeance. I already mentioned how you get the signature bash move almost immediately, and there have already been 2 escape sequences in the first 5 hours. Will of the Wisps seems to be doubling down pretty hard on what people raved about in the original, and thankfully, the 5-year gap between titles hasn't made those core elements any less engaging. Ori's basic kit of jumps, dashes, and that all-important bash ability that lets you use projectiles for platforms make for stylish, breakneck platforming, where you often string a half-dozen moves together before you ever touch the ground again. Coming off of Kunai, which failed at doing exactly this, it's a credit to Ori's platforming that these long journeys off the ground often require a bit of mid-air improv, yet give you enough tools and time to actually enable you to plan your next move while hurtling towards it. Combine all that with infinite wall jumps, and Ori has a surprisingly high ceiling on what's possible inside of its boundaries. And frequently, the game leads you to discover those possibilities with hard-to-reach caches of goodies you have to puzzle out how to get to. And as the greatest examples of everything that makes Will of the Wisps platforming so enjoyable, escape segments remain fantastic, gorgeous set pieces where the game is at its most compelling. And speaking of gorgeous... Ori and the Will of the Wisps is a beautiful game, but I don't even mean it in the sense that it's got pretty pixels and a few bloom effects. Have you looked at how expressive so many of these animations are? Like, just look at this. And a lot of that comes down to Will of the Wisps' stylization and its non-human characters giving it a bit of leeway, but in few games have I ever noticed how distinctively and fluidly each character moves. And it does so much heavy lifting to make this game's narrative work. Ori's narrative is extremely bare bones and simple. Ori has a new friend named Ku, that friend was born with a bum wing, and when they try to fix the problem, the pair end up getting carried off by a storm and separated in a strange land far from home. And the story is pretty much entirely about Ori trying to find Ku and go home again. Those story beats are straightforward and pretty far between, but Will of the Wisps is confident enough in its animations to use them as almost the sole driving force that sells Ku and Ori's bond, as well as telling the narrative as a whole. And you know, that confidence is well founded, because for me at the very least, it worked. But with all that said, it's time to ask, what do you get out of 5 hours with Ori and the Will of the Wisps? It's hard to say how far into the game I am exactly, but at the 5-hour mark, the game has suddenly expanded into a new section where I have to go retrieve 4 items at the end of their respective zones, so I certainly have plenty left to do. And mind you, I've gotten that far without doing a whole lot of backtracking to go find additional power-ups, so I haven't been dawdling that much either. And overall, I've been having a pretty great time with it. Will of the Wisps combat might not have clicked with me the greatest, but Ori's strong points land far more often and more strongly than its weaker ones. Taken just on its own merits, this game is already well worth a look, but as a great, short game that's noticeably working to try and get you fully into the action as quickly as possible, Will of the Wisps is exactly the sort of game I look for. Hey, if you guys didn't already know, I just launched a Patreon, and with your generous support, I can start doing all kinds of cool stuff like more in-depth video essays and 5-hour streams where I review games like this in real time. So if any of that sounds cool, please consider becoming a patron today. But I hope you enjoyed this first 5 review. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.